Hey, everybody. Randy Martinez here from IT Pros Management. Welcome to another episode of Relaxed IT is Covered, podcast where we basically try to bring technology and cybersecurity risk management down to a level where C-level executives, business owners can really grasp this information and hopefully take with it and run with it. Today, I'm proud to have and happy to have Andrew Scott from Todyl. Todyl is a cybersecurity all-in-one platform solution that's a best-in-class service that companies like myself use to basically provide overall arching cybersecurity services in one single platform, one pane of glass, as it's known in the industries. Andrew, thanks for joining me today. I appreciate your time. I know it's a Friday after Friday. We all want to kind of get ready for our weekend, but I'm really glad to have you here today. Go ahead and introduce yourself, bud.
Yeah, no, thanks, man. I appreciate it. Thanks for having me on. Yeah, so I'm Andrew Scott. I'm one of Total Security Solutions advisors, really helping organizations identify their best security strategies. Really, how can we kind of collectively help secure all different types of organizations around the nation? Yeah, a little bit about myself, I guess, to set the stage. So I've been in security or the intelligence space for going on almost 15 years now. It feels just about, and I really started my career of as an intel analyst in the IC and the intelligence community. And then just naturally fell into, cybersecurity, really building security programs and SOCs and being a delivery consultant and, be able to see everything that a lot of different orgs and types, faced and did well, but also the challenges they were facing. And I think that's really guided a lot of, my career. So really just, kind of working from being a delivery consultant up to, security program architect, you've run a federal MSP, MSSP, services, and then, really be an executive advisor, over the past several years to just really help guide organizations and service providers towards, securing their clients the best they can.
Yeah, it's great to know that something I didn't know about you, about your background in the IC community, which that's something I found out today. Great. A little bit more information for us to share. Yeah, I really appreciate you coming on board today. I hope folks, our audience gets some value from all that information that's in your head. Classified on one side, unclassified on the other. So kind of the first question I wanted to kind of ask you is, again, we're looking to help organizations build best-in-class cybersecurity programs. That's my goal. I know personally, after conversation with you, that's your goal and Todyl's goal. What makes a good best-in-class cybersecurity program for an organization? What is your opinion on that?
Yeah, I think a lot of orgs just jump straight into, kind of tools and tech. And I think it really has to be a step back of really identifying what is it we do as a business. What's really important, what's that lifeblood, right? What data or kind of, production, what is it we do? And then what's the strategy we need to properly protect that? Thinking basically, if I were to lose X, how much pain would it cause me or how much cost would it create? And with that, then you can really start to craft what that program and best in class needs to be for yourself, right? So there's that idea of also reasonable programs. It can be difficult. Fortune 100s have different requirements and capabilities and budgets than many in the SMB or mid-market space even. And so I think that's important too, that there is no cookie cutter program. It's really based upon what you do as an organization and what ultimately you need to protect and how much you're willing to lose. And I think that's the strongest starting point, that executives at the top, and that really means the board, the business decision leaders, C-levels, CISOs, directors, whatever those, top tiers of leadership are, need to really get common consensus around what the business risks are and what needs to be done about that.
I really understand it. And I think that's one of the things that a lot of business owners sometimes miss. And these, again, I tend to say these are sharp people. They're running businesses. Right. They're risk takers by nature, because running a business, it's you have to be a risk taker by nature, but understanding how to manage that risk. And a lot of times they try to delegate that. And what they don't understand is that managing that risk is at that top level of that executive 100%. Position. Yeah, you can't delegate that down to a low employee. And that's one thing I always battle with. The other question I wanted to kind of bring up around the same thing is, how can businesses, especially small, mid-sized businesses, and even nonprofits, what is your opinion? What is a good way for them to really start assessing their risk, their tolerance for risk, and what where those gaps may be, those gap analysis that may have to be done.
Yeah, there's various strategies, right? And there's some that's, obviously openly available, and there's obviously, kind of deeper, kind of platforms or tools that can do this. So I think, to start with, there's controls frameworks or risk management frameworks. So like CIS controls is a great operational controls framework about what needs to be done, right? So it starts out with what type of profile are you, what implementation group. You just kind of need the standards. You're not doing anything super regulated or really kind of sensitive. You doing kind of more in the regular space, or you more of a bigger org that needs a robust program? And then you can really compare what capabilities you have against the controls based upon the implementation groups. That's a great starting point. There's a lot of resources out there. There's also NIST Cybersecurity Framework, which just recently had its update to 2.0. And that's really a structured risk management framework, more about like, what is it we do? What do we have? How are we best protecting it? A little bit more of the broader business risk is weaved in there. And so I really like NIST CSF 2.0. And there's some great resources out there from NIST that are like, an SMB quick start guide and things like that. Now, the challenge can be, especially with this stuff, is you have to do it yourself. And that can be tough for, very time-strapped or busy, organizations and leaders. Also, if they've never been through sort of a risk assessment or posture assessment approach before, they can kind of, I don't know how to best do this. And that's where I think utilizing platforms and service providers, even like yourself, Randy, but, how do we do a cybersecurity risk assessment in a guided, structured, advised manner to truly flesh out what that business needs? And then ultimately, not just what that risk is, but what needs to be done to manage and mitigate that risk effectively. So that's where you get into that people, process, and technology to best protect that organization. I think it's the benefit of really working with trusted advisors and consultant service providers that can bring that experience and guidance to helping orgs rapidly identify this. So that's, again, really, depends on the level of comfort of doing this yourself and what you really need. But I think that's the cool thing too. There's resources of all kinds out there to provide this for organizations to start that journey and to sort of rip that Band-Aid off of where are we.
Yeah, it's great you mentioned that. And again, you mentioned cybersecurity risk assessment. And it's funny you mentioned that because I had a sales meeting, a marketing meeting with our team earlier today. And basically, we were discussing and they were talking about different things. And I mentioned to them, our goal is always to start any engagement with any potential client with a cybersecurity risk assessment, because it provides so much information for us to be able to make those proper recommendations, but also be able to provide, even if they don't do business with us, provide the client or that prospect that information so they can run with it. And you mentioned, doing it yourself. I always say you can't check your own homework. There's always that blind spot you find that you don't look at, you don't see that somebody else would catch. So it's always kind of important for that. You mentioned some from frameworks here, and that kind of leads me to my next question is, what is your opinion or as far as ideas on how can small businesses that are under a regulatory framework or compliance framework, how can they, start implementing those frameworks in a way that makes sense from a cybersecurity risk management standpoint? Yeah,
so I think it, again, it's really time. You got to take the time. It's difficult, right? You got to take the time to really understand the compliance and regulatory frameworks and what your obligations are, and then really identifying, okay, what do we have? So let's take, for instance, like, HIPAA, right? Healthcare security. This is a law. This is a legal requirement. Yeah. You can choose to not be compliant, but that's a risk you're taking, right? A potential liability and breach. But it really comes down to, once we understand the HIPAA requirements, then what do I have, right? So kind of, breaking things down into manageable chunks, I think, of what are the HIPAA controlled assets? Do I even know, right? Being able to, how am I applying the monitoring, the different safeguards, components of technical and organizational, administrative and physical to my organization. And so that's where I think really, not boiling the ocean, but looking at, okay, I need to understand this first, and then start to just gather up the inventory and understanding of what is under scope and what I need to be doing. And so that's where I think there's also a lot of crossover, Randy, right? Kind of what I'm highlighting is actually one of the top two controls in CIS, just inventory of physical assets and software and hardware. You can't protect what you don't know. And so I think there's a lot of crossover with a lot of these different frameworks, but a good way to meet those is simply by creating kind of a phased and structured approach to be able to start to understand where you're at. And then, I think it's really about, okay, now that I've identified the requirements, just doing a quick cross comparison of, am I able to satisfy this or not? Sometimes just asking that question, like, people will know, yeah, I'm an O365 shop, I have a firewall, I get antivirus, but I don't have any log management or security, kind of continuous monitoring or, capability to do incident response. Well, I know where I have gaps. A lot of these things sometimes can be just step back, asking the simple question, do I do this or not? Well, we know more than we do. So I think that's where, kind of it can be difficult for orgs to simply accept. Maybe they don't have the necessary things, but that's why, again, where I mentioned ripping that Band-Aid off, I'd rather rip the Band-Aid off and face reality than kind of hide from it, because then you can build that plan forward. So compliance and regulatory adherence is really about understanding that at its core, and then being able to map what you do or don't have, and then determining what's reasonable for my org and how much am I willing to take on to also not comply. That's a risk decision. You're just choosing to accept that risk and whatever that means for your business. But that's, I think, a good starting point, is just being aware fully of what that means for you and understanding what is in scope before you start your journey.
Yeah, that's great that you mentioned that, because again, understanding what the requirements are, it's always key. And even for companies like us who we have a compliance team, we have people that focus on compliance. We take it, we know we've been through a lot of these, and we still follow the same methodology you mentioned of taking it, a step-by-step, understanding each control for each client and moving it forward. And then the last part that you mentioned about accepting the risk, that's something that, we do have organizations. We internally, if we have a client that decides to accept a amount of risk, we want to make sure that they document that, and that we're, we as a provider are off the hook. And again, this is why you have to be in leadership. You have to have a stake in the game to accept that risk, because you can't expect a low-level employee to sign off on a risk acceptance letter and then it all falls on that person. It's just not fair. Not fair at all.
And to add on to that too, I think it's important also, there may be, you may be in a, our viewers may be in a non-regulated space, right? But
right.
I think it's important to be aware of also, like, for example, state data privacy and breach notification laws. Almost every state has one, and there are different thresholds and what they define as, personally identifiable information. And at what thresholds, if you are breached, do you have to actually send a notice to the Attorney General's office of the state to say, hey, I was popped? And you have to let your customers know. And so even if you're not in a regulated space, there's really also that responsibility to whomever your customers are and you're doing business with to best protect that data. Data is really currency now. And so where I'm going with that is, how am I best protecting that information? And what am I subject to? Even if there is no, like I said, regulatory or compliance mandate, there's likely data privacy and other things that you need to be really aware of. And that's, I think you mentioned, you have your own team, right? But we're seeing regulatory shifts constantly changing. Also, cyber insurance requirements constantly changing. But I think this is where really the benefit of, you can try to do it yourself, and that can be overwhelming, or there's a lot to consider. But I think especially, the service provider industry and really providing that guiding hand and expert insights into taking that off your plate and then guiding you through it, that's where you can focus on really what do you need to do, grow and secure and move your business forward and be able to manage your risk in an affordable and scalable way. That's, I think, where, really MSPs have a significant opportunity in today's landscape to help, but really orgs that are struggling with a lot of the compliance and regulatory shifts that are coming hard and fast.
Yeah, and you and I both know that this compliance train isn't slowing down at all, and it's still going to start impacting so many different other industries other than, for example, financial, legal. It's gonna rear its ugly hand into a lot of things because of the nature of the environment we live in today. Well, thanks for that information. That's really great. Next question I have is really looking at providing, some tips, tricks, some ideas. Can you provide like 2 or 3 different ideas for how businesses, nonprofits can start that process or that journey? I call it a journey.
Yep.
of securing, their environment, assuming management of their risk, and really starting to understand what those risk levels are, how much they willing to tolerate. Can you provide some insight on that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, kind of take it from, okay, let's say you've either gone through the exercise, understand what you are, or compliance, like what do we start to do about this now? I think it comes down to, visibility to start with, right? You can't protect and secure what you don't know you have, or you don't know what's going on. So, I'll say, kind of having seen all different types of orgs in the past, there are the need for, let's, say like a SIM, security information event management, really, log aggregation analysis. I think some orgs may view that as a mature, capability, but I would argue that's table stakes. That's automating and expediting and making visibility and awareness into what's going on in the environment scalable, and using technology to give you those insights into what's happening, what's out there. And so getting visibility into everything that could even identify assets you didn't know about, right? And you're monitoring the network, it's suddenly, there's whole segments I didn't even know existed, or whole systems that I didn't even know were out there, or I thought we were decommed. So I think visibility is first and foremost, in gaining that through network and asset monitoring. A SIM is a great way. Also, just network monitoring tools, different RMMs, or even get into network monitoring tools like SolarWinds or other things can help with that. I think that awareness of crown jewels. I talked about let's assume you really know what you have. It can be difficult to try to secure an entire organization at once, but once you really understand what your lifeblood is, and kind of the best effort in knowing where that lives, just start hardening and focusing there. And that's what you can start to use, let's say, like insights from a SIM to say, well, why is Bob down the hall accessing our HIPAA database or systems where that's held? He has no need to. And that's an example of insider risk. Whether it's accidental or intentional or not, just simply start to learn from your environment and start to lock down those critical assets, because that's what ultimately, if you think about cyber criminals, right, they're going to want to, steal, extort you against, things like that. There's obviously aspects of protecting the broader environment, but really protecting those mission critical functions, services, and systems. And then I think, really also process and governance, and starting to set out, kind of how are we going to track and align, kind of what we have, what those processes are, and then starting to identify, right, people, right? The intersection of people, process, and technology there, of who's got access to what, who's handling those things. I think a lot of security programs falter or fail, or less impactful, simply because there needs to be defined swim lanes and outcomes and metrics. And so don't overlook that as a business and security leader of establishing, because that gives your staff a guiding light to move towards, but also how you can start to grade and know how your program is performing, and then therefore inform that risk. So I think it really comes down to, as I said, like visibility and awareness of what's going on in the environment, really protecting at its core the crown jewels, then working your way outwards, but also then really looking at that intersection of process, governance, right? Not skipping that, because that's going to be a key part of assessing your risk down the road. And if you don't do that, you're constantly going to be looking at it at a point in time, and then you're not going to be able to continuously adapt and learn from your own data. So those are, I think, key starting points, or things to focus on that I think are manageable, or that there's established structures that you can, kind of the orgs can adopt to move the needle forward towards.
Yeah, that's great. And I'm glad you mentioned, the basically logging or the SIEM aspect of this, because so many times we as an MSP go out to clients, new clients, and we implement a SIEM, and then we show them, and their jaw drops, because they never realize how much traffic. And we're talking maybe not a large organization, small shops, 10, 20 users. There's so much data going through that they weren't aware of. And like you mentioned, we find out that there's like systems over here, there's a computer, a server hidden somewhere. Yeah. It's insane how much information you can gather once you start looking. But yeah, I'm a true believer. And I refer to kind of when I was, a kid, I was a kid. I was pretty much an adult. My kids watch this. It's the old G.I. Joe thing, the old G.I. Joe cartoons. And one of the things at the end of the show, they always said, hey, knowing is half the battle.
Right.
And it's exactly the point you were saying, is that you're 50% of the way there.
Exactly. And I think too, I'll add on as well, doing whatever you can as an organization to maintain situational awareness of the cyber threat landscape. And what I mean by this is, it can be difficult, but there's tons of newsletters and tons of websites out there that share new, exploits and, 0 days or vulnerabilities or things like that you can take to make aware, of what's going on. So where I'm saying this is, not just visibility into an environment, but, like the continuous emerging threat and priority, of I think adversaries using stolen credentials and identities. A endpoint, saying, hey, I've got antivirus, I'm good. Well, that's awesome. I'm glad you're protecting your endpoints, but you're still blind to, account compromise, business email compromise, adversaries and cyber criminals using stolen credentials to, really hide, and be able to assume the access and steal data. That's a real thing that's been happening over this last several years that requires visibility beyond what many orgs may have. And so being knowledgeable about what those cyber, threat trends are, and what you're doing then to address that is, I think, also equally important. And just starting to create that, fostering that awareness of what's out there, what do we need to be battling, and how am I best protecting against it?
Yeah, we spend so much time, especially getting information from organizations like Todyl, from your organization, threat intelligence we call it.
Yes.
Basically all that threats coming in and being able to start being aware of that. So that's great. Kind of moving on to the next thing is, and this is kind of maybe building on to the thing you just talked about. So let's say you start your journey. What are some of the best practices to continue developing that robust cybersecurity program, that risk management program, and maintaining it? I mean, it's a journey. It's not like today you turn on a switch and walk away.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm glad you mentioned maintaining. I think a commitment to continuous improvement needs to be driven down from the top. That we're not just doing security once. Like, we have a plan, a strategy, and we're going to commit to it, because risk is an ever evolving thing. So I think that's part of it, right? Culturally, leadership needs to say, this is the direction we're going to best protect the business, and this is how we're going to do it, right? We're gonna need to continually monitor that, and that's part of that governance structure I mentioned. Beyond visibility, I think once you start to really get a handle on what's going on in the environment, right? Also, layering on, it should be at the beginning, but network security, arming your perimeter, right? Preventing things from coming in, but I think that next step is starting to, once you learn what your assets are, what's happening in the environment on the perimeter, really starting to segment out and control, limit what we call the blast radius. So, kind of network segmentation, we have, different, VLANs or network segments, and I want to prevent access laterally between those, unless by exceptions. This is really that zero trust concept that, can be a little bit overwhelming, but it's really about, least access, least privilege, assuming breach, right? Protecting those crown jewels. So I think starting to then learn from what the platforms and security program is telling you, and starting to then tighten down those controls. So a conditional access is a really key, valuable, approach here of not just, hey, once a user accesses the environment, they've got free reign to move wherever. I'm going to start to look at what that user does. Bob and Judy down in finance do not need access to your developer network and environment in AWS. I'm going to start to wall that off. God forbid if their credentials were stolen, couldn't be, one, they wouldn't be able to, they'd be limited to only what they have, but they couldn't move into my production, my development, environment. That's just a use case. But starting to then tighten and do that continuous improvement, I think, is a good one. The other thing that I'll really highlight that I would introduce as a initial security capability, but vulnerability scanning, assessment, and management, patch management. Adversaries are exploiting a lot of vulnerabilities on internet-facing systems, but also think about users in mobility, right? And, kind of moving around, traveling, remote workers, being able to, systems that may be internet-facing or exposed, patch management and closing up those holes, is really critical, and being aware of those vulnerabilities. And I think there's a lot of standard solutions approaches. We've all seen the Windows updates that, go on Windows machines or whatever. But being able to really take that into account, I think, can close up a lot of gaps and show progress of that program, that we're closing up these open vulnerabilities and we're patching those holes appropriately, and we have awareness of what those vulns are. I think that's a key component of a security program that really can't be overlooked, especially with compliance, where there are expectations about system hardening, patching, et cetera.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned mobility. Obviously, in today's world, we're all moving around. I think the days of the desktops are long and gone. Everybody's got a laptop because you move around so much. And people don't understand is like you're exposed. Every time you leave that hopefully secure corporate network, you're exposed unless you have solutions like what Todyl provides, SASE, because VPNs are dead. VPNs are a dinosaur technology. New thing is that SASE model where you basically have your firewall on your device all the time and it's being controlled and managed properly. But with that said, again, having that continuous level of improvement, bringing in new solutions, new technologies, and kind of retiring the old stuff like, VPN out the door, SASE coming in, is kind of the way we have to really build these systems out. Moving on to kind of the next area of kind of building out that cybersecurity program for me specifically, one thing that differentiates, our company specifically and other companies that work in the same model that I do, is that holistic approach of not just understanding tools, solutions, all these acronyms that we've been using during this talk, but now looking at the the human firewall, I call it. Yeah. What is your idea, or what do you think about implementing, security awareness training in employees, stakeholders, people in your organization? And we call that last line of defense, which is that human behind a keyboard.
Yeah, absolutely. I would actually shift it. I think the humans are need to be considered one of the first lines of defense because they're always the weakest link, right? So, I guess whichever way you want to, skin that. But I think security awareness is one of the most impactful approaches and techniques can be done to prevent a breach. IBM's cost of data breach report of 2024 identified it that it was like one of the top three, if not the top technique that can be used to limit or reduce the cost and impact of a breach, right? So that being said, it really starts at the top. I mentioned commitment, and I mentioned, really being able to say, we have a strategy and a plan. We're not just going to do this once. Security awareness and kind of a culture, security aware culture in a business needs to come from the top. And that leadership has to buy in from risk of, we are going to protect what we do as a business. And we're going to drive accountability about this from the top down. And so I think that's a great starting point, but there has to be that commitment from the top. And then, kind of phishing training is obviously, phishing simulations are part of that. But I think, security awareness and education training programs also need to branch into, right, an understanding of insider risk and what's there, kind of what you do and awareness of that. And, awareness of, kind of targeting against mobile devices. You mentioned mobility, the trend of smishing and phishing and social engineering techniques that are going to be used not just to phishing email, right? And the ways that adversaries are going to, kind of try and target you, but also, more so than threats, like best practices of securing and protecting your data as a user, right? Don't leave your laptop in your car. Don't leave your desktop unlocked when you're out and about. There's a lot of these other things that I think is critical. So I think security awareness really needs to come from the top. It needs to be comprehensive based upon what that business does and ensuring you've got the right education and training awareness mechanisms there based upon that. And then really the validation, continuous reporting. That's where I think the accountability comes into place. If there are no consequences for it's a balance, but I think if there's no consequences for continuous violation of a security awareness program, right, or that training, like if people don't take it seriously, no one's if there's no penalties, then you're not gonna, really grow or foster anymore. At the same time, we need to move beyond, and I think the industry as a whole, cybersecurity industry as a whole, and organizations are getting better at this, but it's no one's fault to blame if someone gets phished and then an incident happens. You don't go blame the end user employee, right? It's that education, but I think really a solid balance of structure and support and enablement, and like we're all in this together, so that people aren't afraid to speak up when they see something weird happening or some sort of, hey, I clicked a phishing email. That protects that business. But I think also, there's got to be accountability of holding those, executives all the way down, right, to the employees there. The other thing I'll say, kind of last point, I mentioned executives and executive accountability. We're seeing this really of, the growing pressure on CISOs, but like it or not, you are likely the top one who's, owning, or maybe not owning all the risk, but responsible for advertising the risk to the board, to the CEO, higher levels. And so that security awareness culture means you need to be aware of what your holes are and your gaps and risks, and informing that upwards and really bringing that awareness of what's going on and choosing not to ignore it. The more the board can be aware, or CEOs can be aware of what's going on, the better they can make a plan or choose not to. But if you don't let anybody know, right, if you're not messaging that culture and those needs upwards, you're gonna have a little bit more target on your back as a C-level CISO or security director. But also, right, it's not following that security culture kind of approach where you are the leading figure there and need to be also, kind of embodying that and bringing the challenges upwards as well. So.
Yeah, that's great that you mentioned that, because again, that's something we see all the time, where that education, that training, and that information going up and down the food chain basically is not being done. And I for our company, we basically provide the information. So we see it because we're implementing solutions, and we provide the information, and we're saying, here's where we see holes, here's where we see problems. And sometimes, unfortunately, it goes either on deaf ears, or it's like, it's okay. And again, for us, we've gotten to the point in our business model, because of the level of liability that we face, and how much risk are we willing to take on from your company? Once we show you the risk and saying this is a problem because we know it's a problem and you don't want to do anything about it, can you please read this letter and cite it saying you're assuming all this risk? Because again, I mean, you mentioned cyber insurance earlier, and again, a lot of these pieces fall into play with cyber insurance, especially security awareness. These companies are requiring it now for policies. It's not even an option anymore. You have to do these things. And we provide those type of, formal trainings to make them more meaningful. And I know in a lot of the industry right now, we are seeing more of these security awareness training programs become more, I wouldn't say fun, but more entertaining, kind of that Netflix type of feel.
Gamification is so key, right?
That's the word I was looking for.
Yeah, exactly, right? Like, you reached a new milestone or certain things. I mean, what can be, maybe historically seen as like, oh, I got to go through this training again, right? Give you little, kind of characters and, whatever, right? But gamification is a strategy to get people invested in those milestones. That just speaks to kind of human psychology and behavior, right? So think about how you attack that, right? That can be a thing. And I also wanted to throw out another idea, and it can be a little bit, I don't want to say controversial, but security training, again, I mentioned the consequences or penalties or driving accountability. But with end users being either the last line of defense as well as the biggest, the weakest link in orgs, I think we see this with the zero trust, architecture and operations models. But I think there's opportunities to also, in conjunction with a strong security awareness, training program and education training program, thinking about what can we take off of our users' plates. Is it their responsibility to truly protect the org from a user perspective, or is their job to make widgets or to write reports or to do analysis or what have you? And so we're seeing evolving security tools and technique, capabilities with AI and ML that are getting increasingly, better and better. And so thinking also about the balance of how much can I take off my end users' plates to be responsible for and control with technology. So, for instance, like phishing emails, adversaries are always adapting, but there's also really great, strong, robust email security platforms these days that are really using AI and ML to adapt, to learn, to prevent those emails from coming in the first place or limiting the impact if they are clicked or whatever. And so thinking about what security capabilities you have that will complement your security training program to not put the onus only on the employees, but also make their lives easier. I think that's another consideration of what's the level of capability, maturity of your tool set to complement that program.
Yeah, and we're always looking for like improvements, new solutions out there. So yeah, that's a great point.
Yeah.
Kind of moving on to a couple other things.
Yeah.
What are some of the emerging trends that you're seeing in cybersecurity and risk management in the next couple of years that you would say, hey, we've really got to keep an eye, a pulse on this?
Yeah. I mean, everyone's going to say AI, but before I get to that, I'm just going to stress, I think, the continued focus and shift of adversaries against the identity. As more and more platforms integrate, as identity becomes the new sort of crossover, we see like SSO and using people's Google's accounts to access all different types of resources, the continued targeting of identity, and I think, gap in security monitoring and response capabilities and detection response capabilities around user behavior and what is and is not legitimate or stolen credentials, that's a very real pain point and technique and trend that isn't slowing down, but I also think is something that will, continue going forward. So it's like, hey, this is not that it's coming soon. It's here, it's been here, and it will continue to be here. And so if really organizations aren't looking at the identity and monitoring that and enforcing that and restricting it on like need to know, required access, that's going to be a key thing, I think, that orgs need to address. Supply chain risks, I think, is the other big category. Yeah. And being aware of, the technologies and vendors you leverage in your technology stack, not just security. Like everyone uses Microsoft. Unfortunately, they got into some holes. There's always Patch Tuesday every month, but being aware, risk of what are the open vulnerabilities and targeting of, Microsoft systems, also the cloud, right? As cloud becomes more and more adopted, as it becomes easier and easier to leverage, more services like SaaS solutions are up there, being aware of what that third-party risk is exposing you to and how you be protecting, it's not me, it's you, right? How am I protecting myself from the people I do business with or the technology or service providers, but also being mindful about your exposure to them, right? What is it that if you have a lax security program and you get popped, what could that do to others? We have seen instances where organizations suffer business email compromises and are sending out phishing emails and delivering, malicious spam campaigns out of their compromised inboxes. Some orgs are saying, I'm not doing business with you. I'm ceasing off email comms until you fix this and show me that you've done it. So I think that really supply chain and all the different components of it, from a technology, services, kind of cloud and other things of where data is moving, is critical. I mentioned AI, it can't be overlooked. I think, AI is definitely part of a rapidly adapting and, just the speed of adversaries, right, to be able to wage new campaigns. But also I think about it from just simply, get all the way back to the beginning of a conversation. What is it you do and what data do you hold? And how are your employees using AI smartly and securely and properly? Is data leaving your front door because people are loading up, sensitive information into LLMs or ChatGPT or other things? Do you even know who's using ChatGPT? Being able to use that awareness can help you control that. But I think those are three really key areas that I think it's important to always look forward, but it's important to not get stuck on the shiny object of tomorrow and really focus on the fundamentals and existing state of today, where identity threats, supply chain, technology and vulnerability exploitation, data leakage are all really key things that orgs can do to secure what they do now, which will protect them down the road in the future with those best practices.
That's deep, Adam. I mean, that's deep. That's really deep. That's a deep statement right there, man.
Yeah.
You got me on that one. You got me. I'm glad you mentioned the supply chain, because I know we're starting to see in real world terms here, and this is coming from a guy that's in the field, on the trenches, on the front lines. We're starting to see, and not only for business but for nonprofits, we're starting to see grants for nonprofits specifically that have carve-outs regarding cybersecurity and risk. That if you don't have these things, you're not eligible for this grant. And we're starting to see that with contracts too, obviously in business. If you're not doing X, Y, Z, you can't do business with us. So this is not just a cybersecurity, two geeks here talking. This is like real world business.
Well, and yeah, supply chain of, like, as I mentioned, it's not me, it's you, but being mindful of what your org does in the supply chain of your industry or ones that you are adjacent to. So, manufacturing firms need to really understand where they sit in that supply chain of, you building widgets for a, bigger widget. Are you the end user producer? Are you producing raw materials? And what happens if I can't deliver? There might be contractual and legal penalties. Like, there might be fines. Like, those businesses might go after you, for litigation and breach of contract. And so being aware of that tangible dollar risk and what you are as a supply chain, in that supply chain, I think is really, really critical. And yeah, as you mentioned, security requirements and contracts, we're seeing this more and more also with the classification of SOC 2, where orgs are more willing now and preferring to do business with, I have a choice of two vendors and one SOC 2 versus the other. That SOC 2 attestations, I have process and security structures, and I'm properly protecting myself. They're starting to choose and prefer ones that are SOC 2 certified versus not. And so taking security seriously is also a business differentiator for many organizations.
Yeah, that's great. And I've seen that. I've talked to some SOC implementers and organizations that do that. And that's one big thing that they mention. As we're getting close to kind of the end here, really kind of looking at, we've talked about different pieces of cybersecurity risk management, but what are some of the challenges? I know you deal with a lot of companies like ours and their clients specifically. What are some of the challenges that you're seeing that companies, nonprofits are having on implementing a comprehensive cybersecurity program?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, first and foremost, it comes down to cost. I mean, security is expensive. It has always been it can be expensive. And I think historically it's been seen really as a cost center, where, like, what's the ROI that I'm getting? And, I'll counter to that. And I think, based on what we were just saying about SOC 2 contracts, I think reframing it as an investment center can really, and that just culture and perspective can help, right? But how am I securing the revenue or mission, revenue generator or mission critical lines of my organization? But, cost, right? So that's where I think really understanding what you have and that idea of a reasonable security program. It can be difficult for nonprofits and, SMB and mid-market companies to do what Bank of America does or United Airlines, or you're not that size, and that's okay.
And even sometimes they don't get it right.
They don't even get it right. When the big boys are getting popped too, it's like, we're all in this together. But I think the cost, just being aware of, okay, but how can I really make the best use of my funds and my money to best protect me? And I think that's where challenge can be seen. I have to buy tools, I have to do it myself. But I think really, the power of organizations like yourself, the managed service providers, managed security service providers, to bring the security capabilities to those orgs at more of a fraction of the cost and best manage that risk without having to go through buying those tools, hiring the staff, all that can be really beneficial. Another challenge is really just buy-in, right? I mentioned from multiple stakeholders. Maybe you have a really strong, and decisive CEOs like, we're doing this and it's the way, which is awesome, but you're going to need to get the buy-in, not just from the security lead, the CISO who wants that program, who's trying to move things forward. That CFO and financial leaders also got to be willing to invest in it. You got to have the other, teams be willing to work through the pain, unfortunately, as you start to, tighten up access, people are going to get frustrated. I used to have access to YouTube on lunch. Now I don't. Well, that's just part of our risk, right? That we're willing to now not allow you to do from corporate asset. So, kind of the final one I'll say is like a plan and commitment to deploy that program, right? If you're not committed, if it's not part of that strategy for your business, that's where I'm getting out that investment, center versus cost. That program may not succeed because the moment that people start yelling that they can't get access or other things, if you don't have sort of, unfortunately, the organizational fortitude to see that through and say, this is the line we're taking because we have to best protect this, that's where we start to see exclusions. And it's exclusion. That becomes a slippery slope. So I think really that culture of committing to being a security aware and risk-driven organization to best protect the business and connecting IT and security risk to business outcomes and objectives. Without that, yeah, you might start to have some challenges down the road once you start getting pushback or lack of funding.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I see that where, organizations like ours, like you mentioned, come to the table, I think, and one thing I always tell folks when I'm talking to them about this subject is we vetted solutions. So that's off of your plate. We're bringing in best in class solutions like Todyl, like other platforms out there. But we've taken the time to vet, to discuss, to negotiate, to get the best in class that we can present to our clients, because that's what we want. We want best in class for our clients.
Of course.
Plus, we come in with the idea of, you mentioned, understanding security for multiple industries. Somebody like myself, I've supported tons of different industries. I understand the business model, I understand the revenue model, and I understand, the business goals for different industries and know how to apply those solutions appropriately. So we're not getting into an overkill. If I take a DoD contractor that's building the new F whatever strike fighter, security, take that security and put it over here to Mr. and Mrs. CPA firm that has 3 employees. Obviously, That's not going to work. That's going to be overkill. But we basically want to make sure we bring in best in class and we bring in, like you mentioned, that appropriate level of security for that organization and make sure they understand what their risks are. But yeah, I really like that insight you took there. Kind of my last question is here, kind of looking at, you work with a lot of companies, you work with a lot of different vendors, a lot of different clients, and they work with different clients. Do you have an example of, an MSP you've worked with a client that you kind of looked at it and you go, damn, they did a really good job putting the cybersecurity program. Can you shed some light on that? Give some tidbits of what they did to make that happen?
Definitely, yeah. So, was working with an organization that was serving a fintech company. Okay. And so financial technology, and that organization was really stuck in a reactive security, kind of approach and very much a point solution driven approach. They're spending a lot of money on tools, but they're still reacting. We're still, kind of often having challenges and the performance of the program really wasn't there. There really wasn't a strong program. And unfortunately, it's the state of many organizations.
Were they under a compliance model? Were they under FTC?
Yeah, there was, PCI, FINRA a little bit too, based upon kind of what they were doing. So, they were trying their best to do that. But, really it came down to we had to take a step back and say, kind of what are the lines of business, the requirements, what is it you do, and then ultimately what do you have to comply with? And then from there, we really crafted that plan, right, together to say, all right, what's that strategy? And we started to see that shift towards productivity. They got the visibility they needed, the various protections, started to get a process and approach of learning from what their program and tools were telling them and starting to tighten those up. And so really what we ended up getting to was a very, kind of more robust proactive security program there, that it was in a co-managed state, right? But having the best use of their staff, right, to focus on the higher level projects or deeper, more advanced security functions. They have the necessary kind of back end SOC support and reporting and monitoring. They were getting all that streamlined. And then really that awareness of what's the risk and implications to our systems, et cetera. And we really started to see a cultural shift, which was cool. So security was able to start informing even the way that they were building their products. So it shifted into, hey, how are we starting to get ahead of, kind of, protecting, kind of the development, groups, and allowing them to get a little bit more aggressive with the way that they were, innovating, because they were able to do so with confidence. And so that's again where I think, was a great example of getting a client to a point where they could start to see the tangible benefits of the business, but because we had to look at what the business did and what it was doing and what was ultimately important in getting that executive buy-in, and that then crafted well, this makes sense, let's do this. So that's why I really think you just have to self-reflection is the most important starting point.
Yeah, and that's great you mentioned that, because that's kind of the process we follow when we engage with cybersecurity risk assessment. People just think, oh, we're just going to throw in some software and let it run and see what comes up. No, we actually, when we do this, we do these very intentionally, and we actually sit down and we'll talk to leadership, like you mentioned. We'll get some information. What are their business goals? What are they looking to do? Those kind of things. And then we're also looking at, what are the revenue goals? What are the revenue? And people go, sometimes they look at it, it's kind of weird. So why do you want to know my revenue? I said, well, because I need to know, what are we protecting?
Right.
I need to know what's the target. What am I protecting? Am I protecting $1 million a year in revenue, or am I protecting $50 million a year? It's going to be a little bit different way of protecting things. And we understand how big the business is based on that revenue. So sometimes, we get that kind of weird look from prospects, like, why you need to know that? And I have to sit down and explain to them that we are protecting your revenue. That's the bottom line, and your data, but revenue is your cash cow, and we need to protect that cow.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I'm so glad you mentioned that, really, because that's the key of risk, right? Business risk is, like I said, what is it that I do, and how much am I willing to lose? And so the more that you can tie in the way that you're securing those lines, revenue generating lines of business, or whatever the mission is that it does, like let's say nonprofit, but the donation lines, and being able to, without donations, that gets popped or you're down, you don't have the ability to fund the critical work that you do. And so, kind of what are we doing to best protect that? That also creates a tangible value of risk that the business can identify. What do I need to protect? And so I'm really glad you mentioned that. I wish more orgs were having those conversations or really thinking about that. So I think that would move a lot of cyber defense and kind of postures forward.
Yeah, exactly. Well, Andrew, I really appreciate you taking the time. I want to get back to your day here, but I certainly appreciate your time. I look forward to maybe having other conversations like this with you. For our audience, Andrew Scott Todyl, I certainly appreciate him. I'll be in contact, but I really appreciate this. I know we have conversations regularly, so look forward to getting another one like this and recording it and giving it out to the masses.
Sounds good, man. Yeah, appreciate it. Thanks for the invite, Randy. Glad to speak with you.
All right, buddy. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Cool. Bye.
Bye-bye.